Everybody, Eve Harow, Director of Community Development and Tourism for One Israel Fund. Delighted to have you with us tonight in what is going to be the last webinar of 2020. We're all assuming that 2020 will end at some point, and we will continue this into 2021. For those of you who are not familiar with the One Israel Fund, we have for over a quarter century given out millions of dollars to enhance the lives of the Jews living in Judea and Samaria, and also those who used to live in Gush Katif. Synagogues, playgrounds, medical centers, a tremendous amount of security equipment as well. So if you're interested in ensuring that many Jews either stay or move to the communities in Judea and Samaria, then be in touch with us, and we would be delighted to make you part of the One Israel Fund family. So I'm really thrilled tonight to be with Carolyn Glick. And very often people say, you know, our guest needs no introduction. And I think in this case, that's probably quite true. I'm sure all of you know who she is, award-winning journalist and author, gives advice to policy analysts, also to politicians. Sometimes they're the same people, and we can ask her about that. So she's coming on tonight to talk to us about her thoughts for what will happen in 2021. Now, I know that for some of us, an act of faith right now is just setting our alarms for the morning. We don't know what the news will bring. We don't know what's going to happen. Assuming that the election results hold as we know them for the United States, okay? And I know that that's a loaded statement in and of itself. But assuming that come January 20th, we are all going to be dealing with a Biden administration, I know something that makes a lot of the viewers not happy, but assuming that is the situation, we're going to hear from Carolyn tonight on her thoughts about what effect, if any, it will have on the US-Israel relationship. So thank you, Carolyn, so much for joining. I know your boys are quiet in the background. It's evening here in Israel. So let's just jump right in. What do you think is going to happen in 6 weeks? Any major changes?
So first of all, you know, I've gotten a lot of people. First of all, it's great to be here with you, Eve, and with everybody from the One Israel Fund. The One Israel Fund truly is an irreplaceable organization here in Israel. It is where we need it to be when we need it to be there, whether it's Eve Harow, who's really making Judea and Samaria real for so many people who've never been here and who don't understand. They hear the West Bank, occupied territories, whatever. They don't know what it is. It's really the cradle of Jewish civilization. Judea and Samaria is the birthplace of the Jewish people, and it's so important to bring as many people as possible here, just so that they can understand that this is not a foreign country. This is not somebody else's country. This is, Jews come from Judea. This is where we're from. This is who we are. Or if it's our friend Mark Provoke, who's the head of the security projects for the One Israel Fund, who just goes around and saves lives every day thanks to the generosity of the donors of the larger One Israel Fund family in the United States. So if you're thinking of any of your end of the year giving, trying to empty out your stock portfolios before you have to pay taxes on those, capital gains, you might think about helping this organization, because they really do God's work here in so many different ways and every day. So that's my plug. I know you already gave your commercial. This is mine, so my extra one. I've gotten a lot of people angry with me and writing to me on my Facebook page and on Twitter and in my email. Why do you keep saying that Biden is the president-elect? So first of all, I call him the presumptive presidential elect. And second of all, the reason that I do it is because Israel is a market taker, not a market maker for who becomes the president of the United States. We get to decide more or less who is the prime minister of Israel. Our job is not to choose the president of the United States, although the overwhelming majority of Israelis, somewhere between 70 and 87% of Israelis wanted our beloved friend, President Donald Trump, to get reelected, but that's not our decision to make. And, there are credible, I think, allegations of fraud that may be systemic, but that's not our call to make. That's the American court system. And so we can only take what we're given. And right now what we're given is the very high likelihood that Joe Biden is going to be inaugurated on January 20th. And we have to prepare for that. Would we prepare differently if we had our druthers? Of course, but this is what we're having right now. So I totally am with everybody who wants and is praying that Donald Trump's legal challenges to the votes in Georgia and Wisconsin and Arizona and Nevada and Michigan all pan out and he wins in the landslide that we think that he won on November 3rd. But bearing in mind that the likelihood of that seems to get smaller every day, we have to prepare. And the truth is that we have a lot to prepare for, because we're seeing really from statements by Biden himself and from people who are working for him, including his nominee for Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken and others, that what they intend to do is ignore all of the extraordinary progress and achievements that President Trump has made in the Middle East over the past 4 years and try to set the clock back 4 years regarding Israel, regarding the Palestinians, regarding Iran, and regarding every other aspect of the Middle East, which means that they intend to try to make the Palestinians put them back center stage. They want to go back to the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, which puts Israel's very survival in jeopardy because it guarantees that Iran will get a nuclear bomb either by waiting out till the agreement ends in 5 years and then they can enrich away as much as they want, or by cheating, which is what they've been doing really since 2015 when the deal was concluded under the Obama administration. So we're facing that with Iran, with the Palestinians. They are very clear that they think that the Palestinians have been shunted aside wrongly, and that the Palestinian veto over peace in the Middle East between Israel and the Arabs, and their veto over close U.S.-Israel ties should be reinstated, meaning that they want to diminish U.S. ties with Israel. They want to diminish the U.S. alliance with Israel. And so that's their plan. And we have to figure out, how to contend with that. It's not going to be the same game that we played with Obama, because we have made extraordinary achievements to President Trump. So Israel is in a much more secure strategic position than we were when he came into office 4 years ago. But it's going to be a very significant challenge.
So one of the things, of course, that we've talked about for the last few months is the new agreements that Israel has, despite the fact that there's no Palestinian state and there's nothing happening on that front, which for a long time was seen as that if Israel doesn't do X, it won't get Y. And it turns out that we can have peace for peace, and we can have mutually beneficial arrangements with other countries. Do you think that a Biden administration would walk that back, or there's no reason that they should do so? And to add to that, or even encourage countries that are still waiting on the sidelines, for example, Saudi Arabia, which is the big country that really everybody's, and it's kind of known, and maybe you can even elucidate on that for us a little more, that there are contacts already with Israel and Saudi Arabia, but it certainly hasn't been done in a public way, and an official signing the way we have with some of the other countries. So how do you think the Biden administration would work with the situation, given the way it is now in December of 2020?
Well, the Wall Street Journal had an important editorial today that I think people should look at, which is where they're talking about the fact that the Democrats are doing everything that they can to tank Israel's peace deal with Sudan. And they're doing that by blocking the administration from removing Sudan from the State Department's list of state sponsors of terrorism. And the specific senators who are responsible for this are Chuck Schumer and Senator Menendez from New Jersey. And they're doing it because they're trying to undermine President Trump's achievements. And this is a really, really horrible thing, because as they said in the Wall Street Journal very well, this is likely the most strategically significant agreement because of where Sudan is situated on the map, because Iran for decades was a strategic ally of Sudan. And it was, I'm just looking at it on my map now. And so this was, they're right at the mouth of the Red Sea. And Iran was able then to really pin down shipping to a lot if they wanted to, or threaten all shipping to a lot, move their move their weaponry to Gaza as well through the Red Sea because of their alliance with Sudan. And not to mention the fact that until 1995, Sudan was the home of Al Qaeda. I mean, they were a major state sponsor of terrorism. And so when the regime was overthrown and replaced with a provisional government that's now in charge, this was a major strategic development for the better in the Middle East, both vis-a-vis Iran and vis-a-vis the Sunni global jihad that we've seen with ISIS and with Al Qaeda so vividly, and of course with Hamas here closer to home. So this was a major thing. And here is Sudan coming to the United States saying, we're willing to, open ourselves up to you completely, to realign ourselves towards the moderate Sunni states, towards Israel, and towards the United States of America, and against Iran and against Al Qaeda and all the rest of the terror organizations. But in exchange, and they've even agreed to put $335 million in escrow to pay reparations to the victims of the Tanzania and Kenyan bombings from 1998, the US Embassy bombings in Kenya and Tanzania. So they've taken all of these steps, and they're supposed to be having democratic elections in 2 years. So they're living up to, they're planning, they're moving ahead on every level. And here you have these two key Democratic senators who are supposed to be supportive of Israel, among other things, and not to mention US national security interests. And they're blocking this deal from going forward by refusing to permit Sudan's removal from the state-sponsored list of state sponsors of terrorism. So this is what the Democrats are already doing. And if they succeed, it's going to be a strategic, it's really, what do they call it? Stealing a defeat from the jaws of victory. It's going to destabilize this government that's trying to make a new start for Sudan after so many years of being a rogue state. And it's going to just give a gift to Iran of forcing Sudan back into that fold. It's colossally destructive, and that's what the Democrats are doing now. So I think that if they're doing this now, you could say it's partially because they don't want to give President Trump the win, which would be bad enough. But I mean, there's no reason to think that that's true, because the Democratic Party itself has become so destructive of US national security. I mean, on every issue, not only in the Middle East, but also vis-a-vis, perhaps more importantly, even vis-a-vis China. So, we're looking at, they say that Biden administration is going to restore US alliances, but really what it's going to do is replace the alliance that the United States has really bucked up, their alliances with these allies, with Israel, with the Sunni Arab states, with Eastern European states, with Japan, South Korea, and so on. And they're going to replace them with other allies, the Western European anti-American states, like Germany and France have been the major protectors of Iran and the Muslim Brotherhood and others. So this is really a problem. Will the Biden administration try to undermine Israel's ties with Bahrain and with the UAE? I mean, it's possible. The Obama administration tried to, and they didn't succeed because the strategic interests that are shared by Israel and these moderate Sunni states, particularly in the Gulf, particularly Saudi Arabia, and we'll get to them last, are real. Iran for them poses a strategic threat. And in the case of Saudi Arabia, it poses an existential threat. So, they don't really have the option of saying, okay, we prefer to go with the United States and with Iran. I mean, that's not an alliance that's going to protect their needs. And regarding Saudi Arabia, I mean, I think, I felt the same way regarding the UAE, particularly when they were saying that if we want normalized relations with the UAE, that we have to shelve the plan to apply Israeli sovereignty to large swaths of Judea and Samaria. And I felt that was a deal that we didn't need to take. But I think that this is doubly the case with Saudi Arabia, because I really don't know, in the case of Saudi Arabia, what normalizing relations would do to the stability of the leadership of Mohammed bin Salman, who's sort of the reformer, the reformist leader, and right now he's the crown prince, but the king is still very much alive and he can change his mind. So, and there are princes who are very angry at MBS because he's really taken a harsh line towards them. So I think that it's more important for Israel right now to help MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince of Saudi Arabia, to remain in the position that he's in and to keep his power than it is for us to normalize relations. There are also so many forces inside of Saudi Arabia that are radical. I mean, we can't forget, that it was the Saudi regime that was really sponsoring Al Qaeda. That the Islam, that the radical Islam that they were preaching, the Wahhabist Islam that they were preaching 20 years ago, really was the creed in many ways of Al Qaeda. So, we're not talking about a society that has necessarily turned the corner, or that if it's turned the corner, that this is something that is irreversible. And therefore, we really have to be careful. We have very clear shared strategic interests with the House of Saud right now, vis-a-vis Iran, vis-a-vis the Muslim Brotherhood. But I think that we should preserve those shared interests by not trying to push relations just to get some sort of a signing ceremony, which I don't think we're lacking.
Mm-hmm. In the meantime, they're allowing Israeli planes to fly over their airspace, to get to the UAE, to get to India, which is when people can once again travel, going to make things a lot easier.
It's also cargo. I mean, it's not just important for passenger jets, which is obviously important, but it's important for exports and imports from Asia.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, look, the question is, what more would we want from Saudi Arabia? Do we need a Saudi Arabian embassy in Israel? Do we need Saudi tourists in Israel? I mean, I don't think we need any of the things that, and are we not able to have business ties with the Saudis now? I think we are, particularly, if we do it in conjunction with joint ventures with the UAE or with Bahrain. I mean, I think it'd be nice if we could have normalized relations with Saudi Arabia, don't get me wrong, and they may have an interest. So if they think that it'll mitigate pressure on them from a Biden administration, which has already promised to be hostile to Saudi Arabia. So it's not that I don't think it's possible that we'll normalize relations. I just don't think that it's necessarily the thing that we should care about the most right now. In fact, I'm pretty sure it isn't.
Mm-hmm. What you say now reminds me quite a bit of the situation that we have even with the Palestinian Arabs in Judea and Samaria and Israel. So there's no official state or whatever it is that they want. And I'd like to ask you what you think is going to happen with the bid for sovereignty over Judea and Samaria, if that is going to really get put in the freezer for a while or not. But on a day-to-day basis, there's a tremendous amount of business that's done, a lot of people working together. So there's nothing official like that, but people's lives, and you know that, you live here as well as I do, we see it all the time. A lot of people are just living normal lives, even without anything official, and even without their leaders necessarily being so happy about it, but they've got their own issues. I think it's timely to also remind all of our viewers that as much as we complain, both in Israel and the United States, about our electoral systems, about our politicians, we vote. And what you said a few minutes ago about Saudi Arabia is worthwhile remembering, that there can be government and regime changes here in the Middle East very, very quickly and in a very undemocratic way, and we don't know what we're going to get next. So I think we need to also appreciate the fact, with all the chaos and all the unhappiness, that we do live in countries that give us the ability to have some degree of control over who makes the decisions that affect our lives.
I think you're absolutely right. And I also think that it's important to remember that, we have a lot of friends in the United States. And the fact is that even anti-Israel candidates for office like Raphael Warnock, who called Israel an apartheid state and has made really, really vicious comments about Israel, that when he got caught making these statements, he suddenly felt that he had to say, no, some of my best friends are Jews, and look, I'm not going to threaten in any way U.S. military support for Israel, and I prize the Israel American relationship. And that's not true. And we can expect, if he is elected, for him to be anti-Israel. But I think that the fact that he feels that he needs to pay lip service to the US alliance with Israel is because the vast majority of Americans support it, particularly in Georgia. And so, I think that it's a different Democratic Party today than it was 4 years ago. It's a much more openly anti-Israel party than it was 4 years ago. I mean, Obama couldn't have done the nuclear deal in 2010. He could only do it at the end of his second term because it was deeply unpopular. I mean, let's not forget, he railroaded it through the Senate by making a deal, which was with the complicity and the agreement of Senator Corker, who was the Republican chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And I think it was one of the worst things that ever happened was that they didn't treat it as a treaty. They didn't insist that the nuclear was a treaty. And instead, they turned the Constitution on its head and said it only needed the support of a third of the senators instead of needing the support of 2/3 of the senators. And that's why it went into force, but it was unconstitutional. And I think, now the difference is, and a lot of Democrats, including Senator Menendez and Senator Schumer, opposed it. They wouldn't say anything other than that they're not going to vote for it, but they did oppose it. And so now you have a situation where since 2018, when President Trump left the nuclear deal with Iran and adopted the strategy of maximum pressure on Iran, the Democratic Party as a whole has adopted this policy of returning to the JCPOA as a party. And so this is a really huge sea change. And let's also not forget that UN Security Council Resolution 2234, which criminalizes the Israeli presence not only in Judea and Samaria, but at the Wailing Wall in unified Jerusalem. This was something that was passed at the 11th hour. It was passed after Donald Trump was elected, and less than a month before he entered office, as a way to smack Israel on the way out the door, and to really set up Israeli officials to be hounded by the anti-Semitic and anti-American International Criminal Court. But this was something that was not supported by either the Democratic Party or, of course, the Republican Party. And today the Democratic Party does support it. And their position is much more hostile openly towards Israel's control over Judea and Samaria and Jerusalem. So I think, that we have to recognize that the party itself, even though so many Americans are pro-Israel, the Democratic Party is anti-Israel.
There's something you said a few minutes ago almost makes it sound like there's an emotional reason here, that even if it's something that's antithetical to US interests, leaving alone Israel interests, the Democrats they loathe Trump so much, and they're going to want to undo some of the things that he did, even if it ends up hurting the United States. And there's this suspicion that it's not that there really is a lot of emotion involved here. I mean, we see it with maybe the perspective of being across the pond, that this is not a very typical situation at all. As a matter of fact, in my lifetime, I don't remember the United States being this divided, this polarized, and people just losing it when you try and have a conversation. It seems like it's at a completely different level. You as a policy analyst, which one would presume is looking at hard, cold facts, figuring out where we're going, what to do based on, but there's this other element in here that seems to be shaking things up. You think that's going to affect some of what the Democrats do? Is their hatred of Trump?
I think absolutely. I mean, the fact is that, anti-Semitism is an irrational hatred, right? I mean, there's nothing. That's why Jews can be twisted in any direction that they want in order to turn us into a caricature. Whether we're communists or capitalists or nationalists or cosmopolitan globalists, we can be whatever the anti-Semite hates, right? And what we're seeing a lot of, and we see it here with our left hatred of Prime Minister Netanyahu, and we see in the United States with their hatred of President Trump, that there's similar obsessive compulsion at the heart of it, and that it's totally irrational, right? So that you even have, like never Trump Republicans who were ostensibly or actually very pro-Israel until he got the Republican nomination, and have either, like in the sense of Jen Rubin from the Washington Post has become anti-Israel, or Bill Kristol, uh, you know, also has become much less pro-Israel than he was in the past, and they were completely silent 3 years ago when President Trump recognized Israel's sovereignty in Jerusalem, and they said nothing when Israel moved the embassy to Jerusalem. And just to think, no Democratic lawmaker came to Jerusalem for the opening of the embassy, not Eliot Engel, not Nita Lowey, none of Israel's such close friends and supporters for decades in the Democratic caucus came to Jerusalem for the opening of the embassy. And these were people who were also fighting for the Jerusalem Embassy Act, which passed in 1995. So yeah, I mean, you're seeing part of it is Trump derangement syndrome, that they simply hate him so much that anything that he does has to be bad. And the fact that he's so supportive and he's such a good friend of Israel legitimizes hatred of Israel, because they hate everything that he cares about, and they want to reject everything that he's done. But here I think that the silver lining, such as it is, his achievements in the Middle East have been so massive. His realignment of the forces in the Middle East towards America's national interests has been so great. They deride his America First foreign policy, but he's been advancing America's interests by trying to neutralize or minimize America's footprint in areas that America has no interest in being, like Iraq and Syria, Libya, Yemen, and other places. He has been so supportive of American allies and enabled American allies, particularly, of course, first and foremost, Israel, but not only the Egyptians, the Saudis, the UAE, and others, to step up to the plate and defend themselves, and to do so with American backing. So, when we were having to contend with the Obama administration, we were doing the same kind of operations in Syria in terms of trying to block Iran from setting up bases in Syria that we're doing now. But every time that we would do it, the Obama administration would necessarily, or not every time, but oftentimes they would leak information about the strikes to the Washington Post and try to make it impossible for Israel to continue carrying on. And the Trump administration did the exact opposite, so that they strengthened America's allies, and he did. And by pushing America's interests, he was also, because so many countries share the same interests as the United States in fighting radical Islam, in fighting Iran, that even as he was pulling back in terms of American troop commitment in the region, he was unleashing the local forces, the regional forces in the Middle East, to stand up and take care of business. And I think that was really important. And if you just want to compare it for a second to President George H.W. Bush in the Iraq War in 1991, he went out of his way to block Israel from defending itself. He undermined, to a vast degree, it caused strategic damage to Israel's deterrent capabilities by blocking Israel from doing that. And the other thing that he did was he lied. He said that there was this coalition of, a gazillion countries that were going into the war with the United States, but essentially there were only two countries that were involved, and that was the United States and Britain. And everybody else were sending, gendarmerie, they're sending a battalion here, a battalion there, and they never shot around, and they didn't see combat, from a telescope. And so the idea was, oh yes, we're working with everybody. We're going to give Assad, Hafez al-Assad, credibility for being a member of our coalition against Saddam Hussein. And he did nothing. And so here you have an actual working alliance where America's allies have been empowered to protect themselves. And in so doing, they're also advancing American national security.
So you mentioned anti-Semitism a few minutes ago. I know it's something you've written about and something that concerns you, the uptick in anti-Semitism in the United States. If you could just clarify, though, because I'm not sure that everybody's clear on the difference between left-wing anti-Semitism and right-wing anti-Semitism, specifically in the United States, and where you think the greater threat is coming from, or it's coming from both sides.
Well, I mean, I think politically, anti-Semitism poses a threat to American Jews and to Israeli Jews on the left. The political right is pro-Israel, more than any other political movement or political side of a spectrum in any country, anywhere except Israel in history. So if you look at the Republican Party, and when you compare Trump to his fellow Republicans, he's not the most pro-Israel Republican.
Right.
There are other Republicans. Senator Ted Cruz could arguably be called more pro-Israel than President Trump. For instance, Congressman Louis Gohmert could be. It could be argued that he's more pro-Israel than Trump, and there are several.
Vice presidents, right? Yeah.
A lot of them. So, and then you have younger leaders of the GOP, like Governor DeSantis, who you could say he's also more pro-Israel than President Trump is. But that just shows the depth of the support for Israel, that the most pro-Israel president in US history is not the most pro-Israel member of his own party. That tells you what you need to know about the friendship that Israel enjoys from the Republicans. But and on the other hand, as I was saying, the Democratic Party has become incredibly hostile towards Israel and towards the U.S. alliance with Israel. It's become obsessively hateful of the U.S. alliance with Israel. And this is a really big problem, and it's staring at us right in the face, and we see it all the time. Kamala Harris is very close with NIAC, the National Iranian American Council, which is the lobby of the Iranian regime. The anti-Israel, the anti-Semitic voices in the Democratic Party are not challenged in any significant way by anybody in the party. When you have Schumer campaigning with AOC and Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar and Nancy Pelosi doing nothing, against any of these women who are open anti-Semites, and they're sucking all of the oxygen out of the room. And one of the people in our webinar just also recalled that Schumer did nothing to campaign for Eliot Engel when he was primaried by a new member of the squad, Jamal Bauman, who is very anti-Israel. And so, they don't give backing to their friends. They don't stand up against the new forces in the Democratic Party that are making it an anti-Israel party and to a large degree an anti-Semitic party. I mean, we see this with Mayor de Blasio and Governor Cuomo, who are actually using anti-Semitism as a mobilization tactic to garner political points from their progressive supporters. We've seen, the whole way that they've treated the ultra-Orthodox communities in Brooklyn, for instance, which has been anti-Semitic. And so, this is channeling anti-Semitism in a very overt way. So that's a political distinction between right and left. And you also see it, of course, on the left on the campuses with the BDS and the ostracism of Jewish students, ostracism of Jewish businessmen, who are supportive of Israel, who are, there was a businessman, Warren Kandel, who was on the board of trustees of the Whitney Museum. He was forced off because he had ties with Israeli companies. These are extraordinary acts of hatred towards Israel and towards Jewish Americans who support Israel, and they're coming out of very, significant points and focal points in the Democratic Party. But there is anti-Semitism on the right, and it's very important that we not lose sight of it, because it's also very important. Obviously we saw it with the neo-Nazi in Pittsburgh at the Tree of Life, who massacred 11 Jews. We saw it with the neo-Nazi in Poway, San Diego, who would have massacred a whole large number of Jews there too if his gun hadn't jammed or whatever, kill another woman. And so, we've seen murderous acts of anti-Semitism on the part of neo-Nazis. And my big concern, and I wrote about it in a Newsweek column, is that when you look at the attempted demonization and marginalization of President Trump and his supporters by the media, by entertainment, by cultural icons in the United States, and their attempt to castigate everybody, and more and more that fake news is the thing, that CNN, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and other major media organizations that have supposed to have been purveyors of information, unbiased information to the public, have now just become propaganda organs of the progressive machine. And Twitter is censoring people, and Facebook is blocking people. These kinds of things can and have provoked reactions. And so, my concern is that this is only going to get worse, under a Biden administration, because Biden supports this. Obviously, part of the reason that he was elected is because they blocked all negative information about him from being known to the public. For instance, obviously, first and foremost, the fact that his crackhead son had been signing all of these influence peddling deals worth, billions of dollars with the US's main enemy, China, and with Ukraine and other foreign countries. So, they blocked this blockbuster story, which was proven. It was his laptop that had all the proof of it. So I think that this censorship is only going to get worse, but people aren't going to stop thinking, because they're being muzzled, and they're going to go look for answers to the questions in all different places. And what we saw with both the massacre in Pittsburgh and the massacre outside San Diego is that the people who committed the massacres or attempted massacre were online, and they were communicating with other like-minded people in various conspiracy theory websites and web portals, where they also, published their manifestos, their Nazi manifestos, before they committed their crime against the Jews. And I think that, as people get more and more marginalized, or are made to feel more and more marginalized, you're going to get a lot more people gravitating to these kinds of websites, and where they're going to be in a very, very dangerous, from a Jewish perspective and from an American perspective, echo chamber that's going to reinforce their anti-Semitism. And I think that you're going to see more episodes of violence towards Jews emanating from the right.
As a journalist and someone who's not known for holding back on her opinions, if I may say so, have you felt any kind of stress in terms of what you're writing? Like, do you think, well, maybe I shouldn't write this because it'll upset somebody? Or you are, you're going to put down whatever your opinion is, even given the atmosphere where some journalists, of course, there's the famous story of, Barry Weiss and quitting the New York Times, and her whole expose really on the environment of intimidation that so many of the journalists have to work under. Do you find that, or you're, here from Israel, you write in Hebrew and in English? And by the way, everyone should know that her Hebrew columns are not just translations of her English columns. She writes original columns in both languages. Do you feel that in conversations that you've had with other journalists, do you feel that here in Israel, you have to hold back, or it's still a better situation?
I don't hold back, because I don't have any need to. I mean, I don't work for news organizations that I feel are going to muffle me. I won't do that, and I don't feel that. But I do see that the censorship that's happening in the United States is very quickly being adopted by the Israeli media. So, for instance, we see attacks on me and on other Israeli Hebrew writers like myself, who are exposing the stories regarding election fraud in the United States, and we're being attacked as conspiracy theorists for retweeting information coming out of Georgia and Michigan and Nevada and other places. And so, people calling for us to be thrown off of Twitter in Hebrew, for things like that. And of course, we have other aspects of that here, which are very similar to the United States, which is that if you are supportive of Prime Minister Netanyahu, if you write supportively of him, then you're immediately tagged as what they call a bibist, which is like, just a blind supporter of the prime minister. Like you have no mind of your own, that you're just a stupid rube who's been bamboozled by this horrible, monstrous man who takes control of your brain and destroys it from within. And so it's, you're getting a lot of that. You're getting a lot of calls in Israel for censorship of conservative writers from the left. But I think that a lot of the media environment is also changing, and both for the good and for the bad, which is why the censorship in places like Facebook and Twitter is so disturbing. And I've been censored by Facebook for 5 years. So they have like this little game that they play with me, which is that they never let me get 50,000 followers. So they keep taking away every time that I get, I've been at 49,980 more or less followers for 3 years. And the way that they do it is that they just keep removing followers. Every time that I get a new one, they take away 3. And they do this because they want to mask me and they don't want people to see me. And that's why I don't know if anybody follows me on Facebook, but I write there very rarely because I don't see any point, because I'm just going to get censored anyway. But when they're doing this, why am I not opening a Parler account? I've tried like 5 or 6 times that platform. I don't know what kind of doctorate and what I need, but whatever it is, I don't have it. Join Parler. I'll promise I'll try a 7th and 8th and 9th time. But the point is just that, this censorship is going on in the United States. It's going on more and more against conservative writers. And Barry Weiss is sort of a pathetic example, right? Because she, in her book on anti-Semitism, she totally whitewashed left-wing anti-Semitism and was considered bold because she acknowledged the existence of it more or less, massively exaggerating the anti-Semitism on the right. And more to the point, and I thought most despicably, she alleged that President Trump was an anti-Semite, and of course, based on the same conspiracy theories that have no basis in reality. And so she was pushing these things, and she was trying very hard to walk a line where she was, giving the left what they needed in order to keep in its good graces. And at the end of the day, they didn't want her. They didn't want her in their camp, and that's why they forced her off of the New York Times. It wasn't for lack of trying that she had to leave. She didn't just give up. And she worked very hard. She tried very hard to stay there and to keep in the good graces of the left, because the fact is, Barry Weiss is a progressive. It's just that she's not an anti-Semite. And that's why what's happening on the left is so distressing, because there are genuine progressives like Weiss who are not anti-Semitic, but it has become a key identity point for progressives, for the progressive movement in the United States, to the point where non-anti-Semitic progressives cannot be part of the movement any longer. And we need to look no further than, I don't remember the name of the man who was the primary opponent for Ilhan Omar in Minneapolis. So he was on all issues as progressive or more progressive than Omar was, except that he wasn't an anti-Semite. And it was because of that Nancy Pelosi, she endorsed Ilhan Omar, and she gave her $10,000 in campaign contributions from her own political PAC. So, that when you look at progressive Jews, we saw it with the Jewish lesbian group, I think it was called Zionists or something like that, that was trying to have a Star of David flag on its banner when they were
parade, right.
on the Gay Pride Parade in Chicago, and they were thrown out. So that what the very clear message to Jewish progressives is that you are not allowed to be pro-Israel and be progressive at the same time. And that also, I think, is going to have, and already is having, a profound effect and a negative effect on American Jews who are on the left, that they would, because they know, most of them, so little about Judaism, and their Jewish identity is so weak to begin with because they didn't have any proper, most of them, most American Jews, I can say most of them, because the fact is most American Jews have no significant Jewish education. And so identity is attenuated to begin with because they're ignorant. And their progressive identity, on the other hand, has been banged into them since they were in nursery school. So, when called on to choose, I think you're going to see a lot higher rates of abandonment of support for Israel on the part of the American Jewish community on the left.
And as you well know, we have many Christian supporters in Israel who I know from conversations that I've had with them when there used to be tourism and people used to come here and I guided them, also sharing with me a lot of the same concerns about their children, that their children have left some of the faith-based values that which they were raised, including love of Bible, love of Israel, love of the Jewish people, and have become more progressive, for whatever that word means. Is there still, and it refers to one of the questions that's come up on the chat, is there something that pro-Israel people, whether Christians, Jews, it doesn't matter whom, in the United States can still do, maybe vis-a-vis Iran? Or, I mean, obviously we have to see how things play out, and maybe our worst nightmares won't come true, and a new administration will be much better than it looks like it's going to be right now. But people are wondering what they can do besides voting, and that looks like it's not going to happen for another 4 years, who knows. What can they do as a lobby? I mean, I remember growing up, Soviet Jewry, and there were many things that we did that it turns out had a major impact on things that happened in the world. Is the world in a different place right now, in your view, because of the internet, because of so much information, that seems like really quaint to have some kind of pro-Israel rally or some of the things that we used to do, but completely ineffective? Or is there a direction that we can, steer people in that would make this in some way better than what we're concerned about?
Look, I think it's really, I think the first of all, the key has to be education. Whether, one of the odd advantages of the coronavirus is that it's brought so much more educational material to the internet than we ever had before. For instance, this webinar that we're having now, so there are about 300 people watching us, but if you put it up on YouTube, then you're likely to get several thousand people watching.
We will, yes.
Right. The point is that back in the good old days when we could actually see each other in person, and of course, God willing, we'll deal with this and we'll get the vaccines and we'll be able to go back to meeting in person the way that we always have. But I would come and give lectures to the One Israel Fund in the United States, and you get 300, 500 people at a pop, and that was fine. But now you in a way you have the ability to reach a lot more people, and so. I think that we have to take advantage of the skills that we're learning as a result of the coronavirus to really work on developing education, particularly for, younger American Jews in junior high and high school, so that they know who they are. Because I think that, you cannot expect, and I think that it was the most unfair thing of all, when the anti-Semitism started in earnest on college campuses in 2000, to expect that these young Jews would be able to pick it up and, pick up the football and start running it. When, throughout the 1990s, they were told that Israel was a synonym of peace process and that the be all and end all of their Jewish identity was the Holocaust, which of course wasn't even it was a historical event that the Jews didn't do any, that we were victims of. We weren't actors, and except, in terms of our heroism, but that was a German event. And so I think, this was totally unfair to these young people who came to campus with minimal Jewish learning. And I think it's really important for us to go back to basics and teach people who they are. And obviously we have a problem. And I think somebody was saying that, who's been commenting, is that, so much of the Jewish day school material is also terrible.
Right.
I think that Israel has a role to play here. I think Israeli organizations have a role to play here in developing educational curriculum that we can then give cost-free to Jewish day schools to use. I mean, I think, that these are the kinds of things that we have to be doing. So in terms of that, and, you even did, I thought, something that for me personally was just really neat and and in a way inspiring. And it sounds a little trite because I mean, what you did was you went to Shiloh and you spoke to our friend Suri Provisor, who is a weaver, you know, and she does all of this biblical type of stuff.
Right.
The crafts is biblical fabrics that she's making as they did in the times of the Bible. And it really brings very much Israel and Jewish heritage and the Torah to life for people who are watching it. And I was personally inspired by that. And I bet you I would have been inspired by that. It's true. Great. You know, I think I would have been inspired by it if I had been, you know, 15 years old also, because it's just really neat. And it brings the truth of this country to people who are very far away from it. And I think that those kinds of things are really important to do, not only when we can't be together, but also when we can. So I think we have to be helping American Jews in terms of building up their Jewish identity in a significant way and not leaving it to progressives and not saying, okay, we're all in this together, because we're not. Because when you look at progressive Jewish organizations, they're not in it with us. And they don't want to educate children with traditional Judaism or with truth about Judaism. They want to pretend that something that a form of Marxism that they've renamed Tikkun Olam, that is Jewish heritage, and it's not, and it never was. And you know, this is something that you know, it can't go unchallenged. It has to be fought as well. So I think that those are things that are very important. And in terms of rallying around something, look, I read an interesting interview today that my colleague Michael Duran at the Hudson Institute did with Prime Minister Netanyahu, and he asked him there, I thought, a really interesting question, because Duran is Catholic, and he asked Bibi, you know, he said that after Netanyahu spoke to the joint houses of Congress in 15, you know, and it made Obama so angry, right? That a lot of Jews in the United States who were pro-Israel were very concerned about it, because they said, you know, this isn't what you do. You know, we learned in 2,000 years in exile that this, you know, you don't question the king. So there are two aspects of it that are really telling. One was that, you know, from its inception, really, the American Jewish community has insisted that it isn't an exile community, that it's not a temporary Jewish community, it's a permanent Jewish home, and that America is the new promised land, and that they, you know, this was very much part of the Reform Jewish movement, that they were not part of Am Yisrael, and that the land of Israel was not their homeland, America was. And so suddenly, you know, when they're looking at this very hostile president and this prime minister is saying that your policy towards Iran represents an existential threat to the Jewish state, without realizing it probably, they accepted the fact that they are an exile community, and that they have to be careful and they have to be worried. And so that was the Jewish reaction and the Jewish apprehension about that, I thought was very telling and very important. And I'm writing a book right now about the American Jewish community. So I really, you know, I found that significant also from my research and what I'm putting together. But the other thing that was telling, and what I think is important, and Netanyahu didn't say, was that as a result of his speech, the Republican Party galvanized as a party and as a movement against the Iran nuclear deal. I mean, there had been a great deal of opposition to it, but as an issue that everybody could galvanize around, that was what the impact of Netanyahu's speech did for Republicans and for very large swaths of the American Jewish community. And that was important. And to the point where I think there were 17 Republican candidates in the Republican presidential primaries in 2016, all of them said that if elected, that they were going to walk away, they were going to abandon the nuclear deal. And this was an incredible achievement. So I think that part of the answer for what has to be done, again, comes to, you know, is Israel going to stand up for itself? And right. Stand Israel when it stands up for itself, and being willing to say to the Biden administration, which has very clearly set out a set of policies that are very hostile to Israel, we have a voice too. We're not going to take this sitting down, and maybe we can't impact this policy. Maybe you're not going to care, but a lot of people will care. And people listen when you speak. And if you speak truth to power, that's a very powerful thing to do. It empowers you. And I think that it's very important that going forward, that people sound their voices and sound the alarm.
So to add to that, what do you say about the issue of applying sovereignty or Israeli law here in Judea and Samaria, something that the prime minister had said he would do that looks like has now been shelved because it wouldn't have fit in with the UAE agreement, or so we've been told. In terms of speaking truth to power and standing up and saying, as you said, this is the cradle of the Jewish civilization and many of the civilizations around the Western world. How come, isn't it high time that we already made this an official part of Israel? Do you think that it's reasonable that it was kind of kicked down the road?
I think that, yes, I think that we should have done it. I think we should have done it 6 months ago. I think that the opposition, particularly from the right to the deal, was
not helpful.
No, I think it was crazy, and I think that it was terrible, and I think that it was unfair because it was blind. Because if Israel had applied our sovereignty to 30% of Judea and Samaria, then the whole shenanigans of Palestinian state would have just disappeared overnight. Because that's just the way things work in this world. What's her name? Dorothy didn't mean to kill the witch when she spilled water on her, right? But you do something, and then that sets things into motion, and it's the same thing here. And they wouldn't allow process to play out. They wanted everything up front, and they didn't realize that when somebody's 90% on your side, go 90% with him and worry about the 10% later. And so I think that was both short-sighted and really destructive. But having said that, I think every day is a good day to push for sovereignty. I think that what we got from the Trump administration was the result of, I'll take a little credit for it because I called for Israeli sovereignty in my book in 2014, which was endorsed by then Governor of Indiana, Mike Pence, and by John Bolton, the former, who became the National Security Advisor. He had a ignoble, departure from the White House. But I mean, these are serious people, and Senator Cruz was behind it, Newt Gingrich was behind it. So I mean, I had a role, but so did so many other people. So did the late Benny Elon, who put together his Christian Allies Caucus in the Knesset and in Washington. A lot, and the One Israel Fund, and so many other groups that you were doing the conference outside of the AIPAC conference and bringing in people to talk about sovereignty in Judea and Samaria. I mean, our actions had impact. They influenced things. And I think that it's important to continue to advance your agenda, because obviously, if you're not advancing your agenda, nobody else is going to do it for you. So I think what Trump did also we should be looking at this as momentum. I mean, he just legitimized something as the president of the United States that was unspeakable in polite company, 5 or 6 years ago. Who would have ever talked about Israel's national rights in Judea and Samaria, our sovereign rights in Judea and Samaria? And here it became the policy of the US government to embrace this and to recognize this. And I think that these things are extraordinary achievements, obviously by President Trump, but really for the Jewish people and for Israel. And we should be doing everything that we can to build on them in the future. And I don't see any reason why we would be barred from doing that just because the Biden administration opposes it. So they oppose it, and we support it, and maybe they'll win a battle, and maybe we'll win a battle, and we'll win the war, because they're going to finish their job eventually, and we're still going to be here.
Mm-hmm. So you don't think the window closed? A lot of it is still up to us?
Well, keeping this on the agenda and legitimizing it is up to us. For instance, I'll just say, I don't know how it happened, although I have my suspicions. There's an Israeli reporter named Barak Ravid who goes around and tries to pick fights about Judea and Samaria. So he calls up the UAE ambassador in Washington, and he says to him, "Did you mean to say that you don't support BDS or whatever it is?" And he said, "No." And then he'll write this big headline, the UAE supports BDS or whatever. I mean, I'm distorting what he's done. But, the Bahraini Minister of Commerce was asked, probably by Barak Ravid, do you support, would you buy Israeli goods from Judea and Samaria? He said, sure. And then, that blew up because the Israeli media pushed it out because they are the ones who most oppose the Israeli left, together with their friends in the United States, the Abraham Accords, because they want the Palestinians to have a veto, because by putting them front and center, they have a reason to hate the Israeli right. So they have their interests. The American left has its interests. The Europeans, of course, have their interests. And there's this confluence of interest, which is always to try to mess around. And I think that it would have been important for Netanyahu to say, we consider Judea and Samaria part of Israel. The US administration just ended all distinction between the two. And we see no reason why you should adopt from the get-go a discriminatory distinction between parts of Israel. And I think that A, if he said it, it would have made an impact. And B, if he had just said it to the Bahraini government, that, then whatever Barak Ravid reports would not be reflected in actual policy. And hopefully that'll happen anyway. But the point is that we should never give up ground without a fight.
Mm-hmm. So there have been many questions that have to do with internal Israeli politics, but the topic of tonight's talk was the US-Israel relationship in 2021. And I know everybody would be happy to sit here with you for 3 hours and pick your brain about so much that you know. We're really going to try and stick to the topic. But within the topic, it looks like we might be heading for elections again here in Israel, because I think 3 months have passed, so we're due, something like that. Do you think that, given what looks like the results of the American election, that will affect what happens here in Israel in our next election, looking towards Washington and saying, well, maybe we're better off with this person as prime minister, given that so-and-so is the president, or that Israelis are still going to do what we think is good for Israel and not really pay so much attention to the messages coming out of Washington?
Oh, I think that we're going to be having elections. And I think that we're probably going to have elections in March, maybe at the latest in June.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that they're absolutely a function of Biden's victory. I think, if this unity government, such as it is, had a chance of surviving, it was only going to be if Trump was reelected. Because facing a hostile administration, Israelis are going to want to have a strong voice in the prime minister's office and in the government that's capable of advancing Israel's national security interests. So, if the Yesha Council and other key players on the Israeli right and the settlements had a role to play in torpedoing the sovereignty plan, the other person, and arguably the more significant person in torpedoing it, was the foreign minister Gabi Ashkenazi, who bragged about it. He's best friends with Chaim Saban, and they work together to torpedo it. So, I think that that's okay. It's terrible in my perspective and in many people's perspective that this happened, but you can suffer this, deal with it when Trump is president much more easily than you can when Biden is. You can deal with this kind of subversion on the part of, half of the government when you're not facing an adversary in the administration in Washington. So I think, now facing the Biden administration, looking at the people that he's bringing in and their records on Israel and their public statements on Israel. And I think that, it's clear that we need elections, and we need elections as quickly as possible. So I think that, right now, the two largest parties that are in the polls, at least, are Likud and Yamina. So, the right wing is polling fairly high, and hopefully that will carry through the governing coalition.
So, you mentioned a Biden administration, but you wrote a very interesting column a few weeks ago that you don't think the Democrats like him any more than anyone else does. And what they really want to do is get the vice president into the presidency. And that maybe they'll even let him go down with all the allegations against. She's really who they want to see sitting in the Oval Office. You still feel that way?
Audio is going out. I think I wrote that as a tweet, because I don't think I wrote that as a comment. I
definitely read it though. Yes.
It probably was on Twitter because, you know, that's where everybody bloviates, including myself. But I mean, I think that it's undeniable that Biden is not in a very good position health-wise. He's not only 78. I mean, there's 78-year-olds, and there are 78-year-olds, you know, and he doesn't look like a sturdy kind of 78-year-old guy. You wouldn't expect somebody who looks like him to be the president of the United States, or to have the kind of energy required of somebody to be the president of the United States. So I think just by that token, I think that there's a high likelihood that he won't finish out a 4-year term. And that Kamala Harris won't just be the first female vice president, that she will be the first female president. And, you know, she does have an even more left-wing voting record in the Senate than Bernie Sanders does. You know, she was sort of a conventional pro-Israel liberal Democrat from San Francisco, but she moved very quickly away from Israel in the past 2 years with her party, and with the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. And she's also very close with CARE and with NIAC. So, you know, I think that she's more ideological than Biden is, but I think that she also is much more in tune with where the grassroots of the party is. And, you know, I mean, he is too, but that means that the people who are really ruling the roost for her, and I would argue for him as well, but particularly for her, are the most outspoken progressive anti-Israel members of her party.
Okay, so things could get even more interesting. Since you said you've got a 50,000 limit on Facebook, if people want to read what you write, where can they go? You've got a website, someplace where people can see everything you put up?
Look at my Facebook page. Just the fact that, you know, Zuckerberg and his friends are trying to block people from seeing my posts doesn't mean that you can't go to my author page and read everything that I write there, and also on Twitter. And hopefully one day I'll be able to get through all of the mess of Parler and set up an account there, and I'll do that. And also on my website, carolynglick.com, and I write twice a month for Newsweek, and I write at least once a week for Israel Hayom, and that's also an English website, israelhayom.com. And I also post all of my English language articles on my website. So you can see the Newsweek articles on my website. You can see the Israel Hayom articles on my website. I do Facebook chats, and I'm going to start podcasting, and those are going to be put on my website and also on my Facebook page and Twitter. So you can follow me on social media as well.
Okay, everybody, you heard. Okay, this is not the end of Carolyn Glick, not by a long shot, just because some people want to shut her down. So
it's just that they won't let it grow, right?
Okay. Thank you so much for this webinar. I know that I enjoyed it, and I know that not everybody agreed with everything you said, which is great, because even though it looks like I'm sitting in a cave, what I refuse to do is live in an echo chamber. It's because I had a little run-in with a bat this week, and so I thought I would recreate that in my home. I had a choice between making soup out of the little guy or just getting out of the cave. In any event, I'm glad that it got people talking and discussing and disagreeing, and that's exactly what we should be doing, is not just listening to people who agree with us, although I'm sure there were plenty of people who tuned in tonight who were thrilled with every word that you had to say. So it goes both ways, and I'm really very happy you joined us. And I can promise you that One Israel Fund will continue finding very interesting people to have on our webinars. And what Carolyn was referring to is a series of virtual tours that I have been doing in the last few months, bringing people into Judea and Samaria virtually, coming and interviewing somebody in their community and what they're doing, and the creativity, the vibrancy of the people living here, since you can't physically get here, at least right now. So for all of the viewers who will be celebrating Hanukkah in just a couple of days, I want to wish you, from very close to where the Maccabees fought a couple of very important battles. And let's not forget that that was the last time that we were sovereign as Jews in the land of Israel, was that 100 years or so under the Hasmoneans until 1948. I wanted to say a couple of things. One is, don't expect to be interviewed by the New York Times. Two, I'm wearing olive wood earrings because it's all about the olives, the holiday. And I just hope that you all, wherever you are, have a safe, meaningful, healthy holiday with as many people as you love that you can safely get together with. And let's hope that next Hanukkah will be a little more relaxed than this one, and that they'll come up with low-calorie donuts, or I don't know, in the meantime. In any event, thanks everyone for joining. What?
Messiah will come first.
Yes, exactly. Okay, everyone, thank you so much for joining us. Thanks to One Israel Fund for sponsoring this webinar. You can go to the website, oneisraelfund.org, and see a lot of the projects that we're doing, a lot of things that we're doing, even though you're not here and you can't actually see them. We haven't rested for a minute. A lot of security needs and other needs, special needs, whatever it is, to keep people touring, living, working in Judea and Samaria. We're not going anywhere, everyone. We're not going anywhere, everyone. We are here to stay. So Eve Harow, Director of Tourism and Community Development. Thanks, everyone. Chag Chanuka sameach, and take care.